you struggle with saying no or simply telling people what you need? Or are you someone who secretly or not so secretly embraces JOMO, or the joy of missing out? Welcome to Audiobook Reviews in 5. This is Yana, also known as Jana, and in today's episode, I'm reviewing Set Boundaries, Find Peace, a guide to reclaiming yourself, written and read by Nedra Glover Tawwab. I've been following therapist Nedra Tawwab on Instagram for a few weeks, but many of her posts have already made an impression on me. I notice her words make me stop and think before I scroll on. Almost all the advice she shares addresses relationship challenges I've heard about or experienced directly. Tawwab highlights plainly and clearly what many people feel, but many can't or won't bring themselves to say. She shares specific, practical advice for any type of relationship, including parenting, romance, friendships, and workplaces. Boundaries are not merely saying no to others or ourselves. Boundaries include a number of behaviors that Tawwab outlines very clearly, including communication, but also how we handle time, money, and even hygiene. If you happen to scroll through Tawwab's Instagram account and feel her advice is simply common sense, consider how often people you know, yourself included, don't practice this so-called common sense. It seems most of us could do with at least a few reminders. Here are some of my favorite pieces of advice from the Set Boundaries, Find Peace audiobook. For social media, mute accounts you don't feel comfortable unfollowing or unfriending. Depending on the platform, this is great advice for avoiding conflict with friends and family who share content that you find discouraging or irrelevant and distracting. You can always choose to follow them again if the situation changes. I also like Tawwab's advice for setting time limits and curating your feed for content that you actually enjoy or find meaningful. You can always change your settings if you're tired of a topic. For physical boundary setting with people, and here I'm thinking especially of those adjusting to more physical contact after the pandemic, Tawwab says it's important to verbalize your boundaries with phrases like, "I'm more of a handshaker these days. I'm not ready for hugging just yet." To handle people who expect an instant response when you text them and complain when you don't, Tawwab suggests you can tell them you wanted to give your full attention to a phone or face-to-face conversation, and that you don't check or respond to personal text messages during your workday. I personally avoid detailed texting conversations, so I've had to do this a few times. For dealing with chronic complainers, Tawwab reminds us to lead by example and avoid participating in the complaining or adding to it. You can empathize where appropriate, but try not to be dismissive by telling the complainer that it isn't so bad or offering unsolicited advice. Instead, it's best to keep these conversations to a time limit you've clearly defined in advance, so you aren't left feeling depleted on a frequent basis. This is an incredibly timely book as many of us look ahead to post-pandemic life. As exciting as it is to see people again, I'm willing to bet many of you are wondering how to reset personal and professional expectations. The pandemic has proven to be an introspective and reflective time as well. Perhaps you're determined to turn a page in a relationship or two, or limit time with specific friends and family members. And for many of us, pandemic lockdowns have provided a convenient reason to avoid certain invitations or events. As restrictions are lifted, this book is a vitally practical guide in how to communicate boundaries and how we spend time with others. As far as criticism goes, Tawwab does seem to focus more on those who struggle with porous or weak boundaries versus those with overly rigid boundaries. In relationships, for example, these people are described as being counterdependent versus codependent. People with overly rigid boundaries tend to have fewer relationships, though, so their problems may stem more from loneliness and isolation versus feeling overwhelmed. Since this often develops as a defense mechanism following hurt or even trauma, speaking directly with a therapist to overcome rigid boundaries might be best. On a side note, Tawwab uses the description of healthy or unhealthy people when I think she means people with healthy or unhealthy boundaries, so that threw me off a bit. Tawwab is the only author I've seen to refer to her own Instagram polls as data, and while I'm not sure this is an accurate take on the general population, it's clear that many of her followers find her advice useful. This book isn't a critical or academic evaluation on why some of us struggle with boundaries while others don't. It's focused almost exclusively on practical behaviors and communication we can use to set boundaries immediately. Tawwab's folksy style might not make her an ideal narrator for any other audiobook, but here it suits her mix of professional advice and personal insight. I cannot overemphasize how practical this book is, so you might enjoy a hard copy if you like to add your own notes or bookmarks. Tawwab reminds us that there is no such thing as painless boundaries. Often, we have to make a choice between putting up with behavior we find exhausting or verbalizing and practicing our boundaries and enjoying more of what we want, but risking relationship tension. The choice is ours to make, and Tawwab's advice brings a lot of clarity to how we make it happen. That's all for this episode of Audiobook Reviews in 5. Thanks for listening. If you have not yet done so, please follow us on Facebook and subscribe to Audiobook Reviews in 5 on Anchor, Apple, Spotify, and many others. By subscribing, you help increase the profile of this podcast and chances of other listeners finding it. I look forward to checking in with you all again soon. Please stay safe and be well.